Horrorfest '89, May 12th through the 14th, a weekend dedicated to frightful nights, creepy crawlies, ghost stories, zombies, horror writers established or aspiring, and Stephen King. The setting, on a dreary and gray weekend deep in the Rocky Mountains at the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, inspiration for the novel The Shining. The host, chairman and organizer for Horrorfest '89, a man as cordial as Norman Bates, is Ken Morgan. The guests of honor include Brian Cooper, artist; Matthew J. Costello, author; Greta Anderson, publisher; Lisa Cantrell, author; Dr. Michael Collings, author; Paul Dale Anderson, author; Tyson Blue, editor and author; Douglas E. Winter, author; Brian Moore, makeup artist and special effects; Ray Rexer, fan guest of honor and aspiring author. The events at Horrorfest '89 included a buffet dinner and raffle at the Stanley Hotel, a lecture on the history of the hotel, the Dirty Birdie Awards, midnight readings both Friday and Saturday nights, lectures from each of the guests, a Stephen King film festival each night, panel discussions, book drawings, an auction of very rare and unusual horror-related items. This tape can only capture fragments of the first annual Horrorfest. For the replication of the entire 18-hour Horrorfest '89 in its entirety, or the complete version of any one segment, contact Ken Morgan of Horrorfest '89. An address will be shown at the end of this tape. This program is not for the weak-minded or weak-emboweled, so please sit back and enjoy.
Left.
The next item, we have a Joseph Window, the novel Blood Games. And the winner is, what's the win three numbers? 785.
Historians give credit to Mr. Stanley and to this hotel for the start of the tourist industry in the state of Colorado. A lot of people have heard of Colorado, but they have no excuse to come out here. But once the word spread about this beautiful hotel in the mountains for wealthy people, people started to come. It just kept getting more and more popular. The following year, they built the Manor House, which is the hotel right next door between here and the main building. It had 33 rooms. Complete hotel. I had steam radiators in every room, whereas the main building didn't. Several years ago, I was giving a talk to a group of people that came into the hotel one Sunday morning. It was cold. It was in May, and as you know, for better months, we had snow, we had rain, we had sleet, we had beautiful days. But this particular morning was very cold, and there were a group of older people came in the hotel in the morning, and I was showing them around, and I'd like to find out who we were. And I happened to mention in passing that the hotel rooms were not heated. And this particular morning was cold. And one lady spoke up and she said, well, he said, if it's cold, you can probably do it today. What other people do? So the place just kept getting bigger and bigger and better and better, and it was the only place in town for electricity. So I am very proud to have worked at the hotel for the last 15 years. The car, well, by the way, Mr. Stanley Hotel for 20 years and made a lot of money. In 1929, he finally moved over to his home, pillars, fed chipmunks. He was pretty fine. He had his doctor died. Then the attorney who had prepared all of his legal papers to make it easier when he passed away, or on, or wherever, his attorney died. Then, in time, his wife died. When a man who came up here died in 1983 with consumption, and had all his plans made. Took 37 years to die. He finally died in 1940 at the age of 91. Me and everybody else died. So if you decide to move to Colorado for your latter days, it's a great place to die. In fact, it's only been within the last couple of years that we now have our own cemetery. Prior to that, we either got burned or planted down the valley. Now you can get either burned or planted up here in our area. Stanley was a wonderful, wonderful man. His brother, his twin brother, came out here once and didn't like him. He went back east and stayed there. He was killed in 1918. He was driving a Stanley steamer coming back to this trip. Driving full speed, which is the only way you're supposed to drive a Stanley steamer. He came up over a hill, straight ahead. Two farmers had pulled up their hay racks and stopped to talk. And they talked, and they talked, and they talked. Probably no reason. He swerved his little car to avoid hitting the farmers and their hay racks. His little Stanley steamer hit a lumber pot and flipped over and he hit his rock. And he was dead before he got home. So that was 1918. So the Stanleys were great, great people.
Let's remember Horrorfest. Now, when people are in the movie business, television business, they have Oscars, Emmys, all different types of awards. Horrorfest has its very own award. Those of you, I hope most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the book Misery. We have as our award the Dirty Birdies. Okay? And I'm going to present, and as I call each guest's name, the stairs are over here. I would appreciate it if you'd come up and accept the award. Thank you. First one says, Brian Moore, Media Guest of Honor, Horrorfest 89. Brian, to the floor, please.
Welcome to Midnight Horror Readings 1, featuring readings from Matthew J. Costello, Dr. Michael Collings, Ken Morgan, and Ray Rexer.
Over the water, and the captain swung it over onto the main deck, beside Prom 2. Simonson kept looking at the chunk of worm. Well, that's good, he thought. Glad to have piece of it. But there was something about it that bothered him. He watched the little ship come to a gentle landing on a wooden pallet. Riley hurried to the front of the ROV. There was something wrong. Riley knelt down next to the broken manipulator, a big grin plastered on his soaking face. Simonson took a step closer to him, and then he remembered. He had seen riftia worms brought to the surface before, and he remembered how they looked all squashed, exploded by the change in pressure. Every cell of their body's dead. But this worm looked different. It looked alive. The smell, the rotten egg smell, was strong, even while the wind blew the warm rain to their faces. It was the stench of sulfur, powerful but familiar, expected. But this was too strong. He could taste it. Ed, don't you think you better get some gloves, a specimen bag, some? And he thought, everything dies when it's brought to the surface. Everything. Simonson took another step. Ed, but this piece of the worm wasn't dead. No, he could see that. The way it shimmered, rippling, moving in the pincer grip in the manipulator's arm. No, not dead at all. Don't, he started to say, don't touch that. But Riley's hand had already grabbed the worm, trying to circle its thick body. He was grinning at his prize, holding it up like a suburbanite gone fishing, not seeing it move, not caring. Don't, Simonson yelled again. But it was, of course, too late. Thank you.
Except that he really didn't have time to be ashamed, because there was a head out there, a head floating as if caught in the fork of a twisted branch, the only thing visible, its two glowing eyes and its filthy hair hanging over its forehead like a fringe of night. What? Frightened and furious at being frightened, Bill jumped to his feet. Who's that? He looked around. Spence was missing. Spence, Bill yelled, that's not funny. He looked angrily at Kenny. Were you in on this? You and Spence always do everything together. Did you rig this up to scare Timmy? Hey, Kenny said. I didn't even know you were going to tell this stupid story. And Timmy screamed again, a long, piercing scream that riveted every boy's attention on him as he huddled by Bill's feet. Spin the red-handed. He's out there. Bill leaned over and tried to calm his brother. Hey, kid, come on, it's only a story. The others looked around nervously. Spence was gone, but the head still hung there in the darkness like some grotesque Halloween decoration. Kenny stepped toward the outer ring of light, toward the head. Hey, Spence, that's not funny. Don't scare the kid. Teddy Weiss screamed this time. Then Timmy screamed. Because what stepped from the shadows behind the oak was not Spence Wilcox. It was Sven the Red-Handed, 7 feet tall, swinging an axe that glinted in the firelight and dripped blood. His hands, so big that his curled fists looked the size of volleyballs, were stained black, but each of the horror-stricken boys knew that the blackness was really red.
Took another step, just close enough to have a look inside. I still have trouble convincing myself what I saw. Or rather, what I didn't see. The box had no bottom. It was just a big dark hole. Suddenly, tentacled arms slithered out and yanked the billy club right out of my hand. I was caught off guard it happened so fast. I backed away from the box, drew my gun, and barked at the children to get into the patrol car pronto. I made my way back to the car, never taking my eyes off that sinister box. I got on the radio and called for backup, calling it a disturbance in the park. How could I have explained it any other way? Within minutes, the lieutenant's patrol car zoomed into the lot, siren blaring. He looked at me like I was crazy when I told him what I'd just seen. He ordered me to take the kids home and said he'd investigate himself. I tried to warn him not to get too close. He looked me right in the eyes and told me to get lost. He hadn't been a cop for 25 years for nothing, he said. He was my boss. I had to do what he told me. That was the last time anybody's seen him. Well, the park is cordoned off now, and there's a 24-hour watch posted. We tried burning it, cutting it, blowing it up. We did everything we could think of, but nothing would damage that damn box. It was indestructible. 2 of the officers who volunteered for the job got too close. They disappeared just like the others. A lot of homes are up for sale now, but there doesn't seem to be any takers. Some folks just up and left. The whole town seems to have fallen practically overnight, and it doesn't look like it's going to get any better. And all because of a stupid little cardboard box.
And whose job it was to dissect the tumor, instead picked it up and hurled it with all his might at a passing nurse, yelling, "Strike 3, baby cakes," as the tumor hit her square in the face and bounded off into the hallway. The nurse wheeled around, tumor gore dripping from her chin and dark obscenities spewing from her lips. She charged the pathologist like a bull moose, tackled him, stuck a scalpel in his ear, and said, "Strike 3, my ass." Another victim of the tumor. The tumor. Well, as it turns out, an old janitor sweeping the hallway found the dirty, disgusting tumor right where it had landed after bouncing off the nurse's face, and he put it in his smock pocket, almost without thinking. Just before committing suicide with his push broom, he gave the dirty, disgusting tumor to his grandson. His grandson, you see, loved dirty, disgusting things. His grandson watched monster movies on late-night TV and read the Stephen King novels by the score. His grandson was happy to take possession of this ghastly, malign tumor and was quite sure he could use it in the near future. His grandson, you see, had big plans in May. This May. Well, that's right. The old janitor's grandson and present-day owner of the tumor from Arapahoe County is none other than our very own Ken Morgan, Horrorfest Chairman. I just want you to know, thank you, good night, and good luck this weekend.
Now that everybody knows about it, just want to show you that we do have a very disgusting tumor. And Ray, since you so had to tell everyone about it all, it's not really.
Thanks, Ken.
It really is disgusting too.
I'll just put it right here.
Thank you, Brian Moore, for making it up for me.
Because in some cases, I have to eat. I like comic books, and so it was kind of a compromise. I like comic books, but the only type of comic strip that I could sell had to be a girl comic. All right, so I still managed to sneak in my own beliefs, my own personality into it, but I didn't actually do it for myself. I'm doing it for the public. I'm doing it for the bucks. But this stuff is purely for myself. It's the garbage that I gotta get out of myself. It's these things are dwelling in my head. I've got to draw them. I've always felt that that's almost like a religious sort of a thing. When I was a kid, I always had an impression that I could almost sort of see things functioning around as demons, I guess. It's just a weird thing. I don't usually tell people this. It's what I thought when I was a kid. You think weird things when you're a kid. And so I started wanting to draw them. I started imagining myself as somebody who could perceive these things. I'm the only person in the world who can see them. I'm going to draw them. And that's how basically how I got started. I started drawing these dead things that are around us every day, kind of feeding off of us. And later I began to kind of distill that down and got more intelligent, went to college, figured out a few things, and realizing that all they are is just the people around me. And the things that we're harboring inside. Kind of took part of the fun out of it, because it'd be nice to tell everybody, because you like to believe in that sort of thing. It'd be nice to tell everybody that yes, there are demons on your shoulder, following you around. If you smoke cigarettes, you acquire a demon. If you have too much sex, you're going to get a demon. And yeah.
Get the image out of your head onto paper. You stop seeing that same image once you've created it and put it down.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. I'm always starved for something new to do. When I get something out, some feeling, this is just this piece here is really just a kind of a hate piece. The rotting lady thing here, the mother goddess thing is just I was just really pissed off. I encountered some people that were ultra new ager types that are very much into the mother goddess and witches and like crystals and all this kind of stuff. And I don't go very much with that faith, but I felt at one point it was being forced on me and pushed down my throat. And there was a situation I had encountered where I made the mistake of picking up somebody's crystal or something, and they had said that I had gotten energies on it, And I felt like I got some kind of plague or cancer or something. Yeah, exactly. And, I was leaving my male energies everywhere. And so I just wanted to strike out at them, and anything I could think of. And I figured, all right, I'll go right for the heart of the matter. I'll go right for what they believe in the most, is their mother goddess, This is all just attack their deity. It's kind of, it's like drawing Jesus Christ upside down. It's just trying to offend them in the best way I can come up with. And that, and looking at early mother goddess images, if you've seen these things, carved in pavement, or these little spiral breast things, I kind of thought that that's something that you would just darn well have to respect, And if I was a caveman walking into a cave and saw that, I'd say, you got it, So that's why that's there.
So I think that's about it.
Are we done? Did I babble for an hour? All right, thank you. Thank you.
I knew that that's something I wanted to try to do. It was just too wonderful not to want to do it. When you read the early Stephen King books, you'd lose yourself. The term papers would be forgotten, laundry be left, dishes be forgotten, supper be forgotten. Everything became unimportant. Nothing else mattered except reading and savoring that book. And if I could get even close to doing that, I would feel that my life on the planet was worthwhile. So that was the motivation. So when I finally, at the age of 32, decided I wanted to do something, I said I was going to write a novel. My wife said to me, wait a second, how can you write a novel? You've never written anything before. I said, it's no problem, I'll just sit down and write a novel. Her suggestion, which was fairly intelligent, was to, why don't you try something a little shorter, like an article, maybe a little something for Reader's Digest? No, we'll jump right into the novel. So I would write a chapter, and then my wife would sit down and listen to me read the chapter. And the best thing about those days was after I put down the page and said, well, she never gave me any false encouragement. She either said, well, it's okay, something like that. Isn't it great? Isn't it wonderful? And I did that. I finished the book, and then I tried to sell it. And surprisingly enough, I did get some nibbles. There was a nice editor, Doubleday, who sent a letter back, and those letters are very important. When you get a personal contact from an editor, that's a big breakthrough, that's a big step. I had an agent of sorts, and there's a lot of agents of sorts that are out there that if you're trying to sell books, you'll run into them. And I'll say a little bit about agents later. Finally, a company named Zebra showed some serious interest, but in the end, they said it needed too much work for them to offer a contract on. And I was a bit crestfallen. I put the book up in the attic, and then went back to step one and the suggestions made by my wife, and I started writing small articles. These articles were about something I knew a lot about, namely games, because that's, instead of going to classes during college, what I did was play games. And so my first piece of writing that I sold was about a game. I did other articles. Eventually I graduated from tiny little publications to large publications like Games Magazine, which was at one time published by Playboy and had a very large circulation. I became a feature editor at Davis Publications writing about computer games. I did pieces in the Los Angeles Times about games. What this did for me, and I think this is the important thing for any writer, is it allowed me to find my voice, the special way I can write and talk. That's me, my personality. It's a sound that feels true to me. It's a sound that feels true to the reader, or at least I hope it feels true to the reader. By writing so many different pieces of nonfiction and trying to communicate, I found a style and a way of writing that seemed to me to make sense. At the time I was doing all this game writing, I also did game modules. I did, these are like scenarios for role-playing games. One was called Call of Cthulhu, which is a game based on Lovecraft's novels. I did one based on Batman and Superman, also Dungeons and Dragons. Again, more writing, but now I was dealing with plot. In fact, plots that went off in 10 different directions at once. And it was terrific training for when I eventually came back to doing what I wanted to do, which was write a novel. How the first sale came about was I was interviewing someone for a book on puzzles. And he happened to mention that he had a friend who was a novelist and maybe could give me some suggestions. So I called him up and said I'd like to write a novel. And my big question was, do I have to sit down and write the whole book and then try to sell it? And what he said, which was very valuable to me, was no. Do 3 chapters and an outline. I did the 3 chapters and outline. I started taking the book around to different publishers without an agent. And this time when it came to Zebra, they made an offer on the book. And that was my first sale. And that is also when I got an agent, after the book was already sold. And that's really the time when you're a beginning writer to go and try to get an agent, because the agent was able to make sure there were no dangerous clauses in the contract. There can be some really terrible clauses that can sneak into a contract, and you're so excited because someone's going to publish your writing. Someone's going to actually take your words and put them in print that you'd sign almost anything. It's almost a Faustian kind of deal. The agent can prevent you from signing that and doing that. The first book was published called Sleep Tight, very much in the Stephen King mold, very much in the Lovecraft mold. It was basically a Cthulhu mythos story, dark, strange things from worlds beyond, happening to ordinary people in small-town America, with kids and houses and lawns and neighbors. The book did well. It was optioned for a film. The film never happened, but that's not that uncommon, and I was off and running. When it came time to sell the second book, which is the book I'll be autographing today after I finish here, I wonder if I... Do you have some water? I don't know if he hears me. Don't want to be difficult, but I do get dry. Zebra had an option clause in that proposal, so I sent them the first 3 chapters in the outline of this book, which at that time was called The Dam, because it's about a dam. They returned with an offer on the book, and now it was my turn to say yes or no. I wasn't too happy with having it at Zebra because of a lot of things that were not the best situation in terms of royalties, in terms of time waiting, in terms of money and other issues. Like, for example, I never saw the cover till the book came out, and the cover had absolutely nothing to do with the book. And at the time, that was to be expected. The book came out, there was the cover. A little girl holding a lollipop with a skeleton face and blood dripping from it. Very marketable, but has absolutely nothing to do with the book. I didn't want that to go on, so even though I had an offer on the table from Zebra, they wanted the next book, and I had no one else ready to buy it, I told them no. And that was both a brave and terrible day. Brave because I was turning down someone who wanted to publish my second book, and I was saying, gee, maybe I'll never publish another book. Maybe this will be it. That turned out not to be true. Otherwise, the book wouldn't be here today. And Berkeley Publishing picked up the book with very nice terms. And the difference was, for example, when the cover was ready, it was based on the book. It had something to do with what goes on in the book. And the editor actually came and brought the cover and showed it to me and asked me how I liked it. It was much more of a personal sense that I created something, and therefore I might have some interest in seeing how it's finally presented to the public. And that was very pleasant. Berkeley will be doing my next book, Midsummer, which is out next August. We just signed into 2 new books, one of which I know the title, which is called Worm, which is sort of like Michael Crichton meets Stephen King. Okay, that's how I came to sell horror, and I've done science fiction and fantasy and other books.
I got started doing this wiping makeup out of my mother's makeup drawer. I think that's how a lot of guys get their start. It sounds kind of a funky way to get started, but if you don't, when I was about 10, I mean, this stuff and the information on how to use it just wasn't available. And when Star Wars came out, thank goodness for that, there just started to be a flood of books and places that carried more, advanced materials. The only place I could get any of this stuff before, all the information was really available were magic shops, because magic shops always had the theatrical makeup of derma wax, which they used to build up noses, and spirit gum, crepe hair, that type of thing for people who are just getting started in it. So the good thing about that stuff is some guys in LA who do this type of thing get so hung up about, I only want to use state-of-the-art materials, they forget about the basics, and the basics still work no matter what. So that's sort of sounds philosophical, doesn't it? But I still like using the basics because you can always rely on them. They never fail you. About 5 years ago, when I met Joya, she was enrolled in Pepperdine, as you can see. And she had a class, and it was what was it? I don't remember the exact name of it. What was it? Seriously.
I'm blank right now.
She's blank right now.
That smells so awful.
Oh, it smells so awful, so she's blanking out. It was a class where I think they watched films and they had to write reviews of the films. And one of the assignments was watching the remake of the remake of The Thing, the one that John Carpenter directed.
Tell who the professor was.
Well, I will, but anyway, she came over to watch it because I owned a copy. And she said, oh, God, I've never seen this. I don't want to watch this movie, but I have to. It's this assignment in a class. And I said, okay, well, let's turn it on. We watched it, and me being the big mouth that I am, just bombarded her. Oh, look at this effect. Look how this is done. You know how they did that? It's all I talked about through the whole movie. Didn't let her watch the movie at all. Just kept pointing out the effects. Anyway, that's what she based her paper on. What she wrote it, there was an awful lot of stuff about the effects. The guy who did the special effects, by the way, his name was Rob Bottin. He's a very good makeup artist and effects guy. Anyway, a couple of weeks later, she comes back and says, thanks a lot. I said, what's wrong? She said, when you made me watch The Thing, you wouldn't shut up about the effects. Her professor, who had read the paper and graded it, his comment was, this is not a press release for Rob Bottin. So I kind of got it. In fact, it turned out to be none other than Dr. Collings right in the front row there. Do you remember? Oh, she passed the class. Interesting side note. We took the same flight out. We're like, do you remember a term paper one time? No. Anyway, sort of a funny anecdote that goes absolutely nowhere and means nothing. I thought it was funny, though.
Brian?
Yes.
Joey was telling me something a little earlier about strange things in the refrigerator.
that she made for dinner?
No.
Which thing's in the fridge?
Miguel Ferrar's head.
Oh, yeah, geez. Miguel Ferrar, he played the guy in RoboCop who got shot up in the knees and then they blew him up. So I remember these people. Anyway, he did a short film called Pleasant Dreams one time. Actually, scoot a little closer to the mic. Oh, maybe I can. He did a short called Pleasant Dreams, and he had a severed head, and it was radio controlled. The eyes had to move, and he had to like go like that, just his mouth sort of open. Anyway, he came to the garage, and I cast his head. He's one of the nice ones who didn't freak out under the head casting thing. But to make a long story short, in the mold making steps, I had to reproduce his head in wax. So I went to the supermarket, bought about 20 bricks of paraffin wax that you used to can jelly with. I poured it in his live cast and got a wax head. Anyway, it had to cool off because that was the only way it was going to set, so I stuck it in the fridge. Anyway, she found it one day. You can figure out the rest, but it beats washing dishes. So, there's always fun little things like that in the house. Before we got married, I did a show called Tales from the Dark Side, and I must have had 24 monsters off that show. And in my old apartment, that's what I had in there, these real tacky horror movie posters up on the wall and these monsters everywhere. Well, me wanting to impress my future wife invited her over to the place, and she just sort of didn't know what to think. Anyway, we don't keep those things in the house anymore. They're out in the garage. Yeah. Were any of you here for the midnight horror readings last night? Well, only a couple of you are going to get this story. Ray Rexer, who's a friend of Ken's, wrote this sort of a parody story called The Tumor from Arapahoe County. You can tell the story too if you want. Anyway, about a week before we flew out, Ken Morgan sent me a copy of the story. Basically what it's about, it's a 4-page sort of a horror parody about this tumor. And it keeps bouncing from one person to the next, and everyone who gets a hold of this tumor goes nuts and goes on a mass murder spree and all kinds of horrible things. Anyway, the way Ray Rexer ended the story was the person who has it now is none other than Ken Morgan, and he pointed right at Ken last night. Anyway, without Ray knowing it, Ken had written me to ask to make him a tumor. So we had a tumor to give to Ray, and Ken just sort of came up, it's like, I got your number. Here you go. And he gave him the tumor. Anyway, Ray was sort of aghast for a moment and went, yuck, 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 and sat down. Another one of those funny stories that means nothing, goes absolutely nowhere. You had to be there. You should be laughing. You were there, okay? Go on. Oh, okay. Anyway. Sorry about your Pepperdine shirt, honey. You can go back for another 4 years and get another one. Right, Dr. Collins?
I think it's something how hard you had to work to get through college.
Okay. And I think maybe we'll put a little more on in the dealer's room so we can get Ken's panel going up here. But that's basically your Reader's Digest version of an appliance makeup. Blah. Time.
How do I look? Mirror? That's okay. Do mirror?
Yeah. Just stand up and look at the camera.
How do I look?
I love her. God, I love her.
Do you have mirror?
Let them get some photos. Because I gotta get this in.
And what do you think? Sorry, Matthew Costello, since you sat down here.
Well, thank you, Tyson, very much. You were proud to be here today. The reason, to me, why Stephen is king is compulsiveness. I read nothing but comic books when I was growing up, except the books at school, and didn't see any reason to read anything else until I read a book called 7 Days in May, which was not a horror book, and I found something better. But books like that were far and few between. But when I first started reading Stephen King, it was almost a new level of being riveted, of being glued to the page, of having to know what was going to happen. The kind of savoring of a book, of loving every single page, of turning it too fast and saying, I'm reading this book too quickly. It's very much too fast. And I think a large part of that is his ability to speak to all of us and to hit us where we live, so to speak.
Sometimes I don't like to read that, so we put them right out there on the page and we go along with them for the ride. The other aspect is his ability to do that consistently, to keep doing it, to keep telling stories. It's almost the reverse of the kind of compulsion that you talked about, the compulsion to read it as compared to the compulsion to write. They dovetail very neatly with Steve King. There's an aspect to him that is alive with a nervous energy that's all about telling stories to other people that lack calculation, that lack, at this point, any real being concerned about what the marketplace thinks of the fiction, but just puts out there the stories that he has to tell in a very remarkable way. In the thumbnail sketch, I guess that's where my position comes from. Please go.
Very wet electrical accident here. Down there.
I do think it's a storytelling ability, just the basic, old-fashioned type of sit around a campfire and tell stories. And he gets us on that level, and it's a multi-level thing, too. I don't think that he ever writes down to an audience, and neither is he pretentious in writing. And there's something there for almost every level of reading that you want to do. If you want just a good, entertaining story, read, you've got it. If you want to get a little bit more deeply into plot, characterizations, development, you got that too. I know as a writer, the more I have been writing, I read differently, and many of you out there who are writers and aspiring writers will probably have the same experience. I look at a book much differently now as a writer. I tend to be unable to forget that I am a writer reading a book, and I tend to analyze. I tend to see what kind of style they use, how they develop, and all sorts of technical things. So it takes more now for me to forget the writer part.
And others, pages where it just didn't sound like anyone was real or anyone cared. And at the very bottom are books that I consider offensive, possibly even obscene.
And not for anything to do with language or plot or character or anything else, but it's simply because the author brings someone out for the sole purpose of killing them off. And the author does not care about that character. And the reader cannot care about that character. When I read Stephen King, only recently, as I have become hypercritical, have I begun noticing even wobbles. I still haven't found any real flaws in his presentation. And I've gone back and reread all of King many times and reread many of these other people, and it still holds true. There is simply a qualitative difference in the way he handles words between Stephen King and virtually every other horror writer, dark fantasy writer I have seen.
I have to agree with that. I sort of fell in love with Stephen King's use of language when I first came across The Dead Zone, and of course The Stand, and all the way through the books that followed. Every Stephen King story I could get my hands on. Here was somebody who not only cared about the way he used language, but he cared about the reader, and he cared enough to make sure he used the right words to reach the reader. And he reached me. A lot of other authors have been able to do that too, but none in a way as successfully as King has done. The interesting thing, Lisa and I obviously approach King's work from the novelist viewpoint, and I sent a letter off to Ken Morgan right after I heard about the topic of this panel. And this is what I said, the answer to Tyson's question, why is Stephen King? My answer is characterization. Steve makes his characters come alive, makes us care about them as much as or more than we care about people we know in real life. His characters think like real people.
I'm not sure. I think that one reason is tied in with something that someone said to me on the set of Maximum Overdrive when I went over to Wilmington, North Carolina to interview Stephen King for the first time for Castle Rock and for Twilight Zone. I was talking with another writer, I believe he was writing for USA Today at the time, and after the interview was over, we were sitting around behind the Dixie Boy truck stop getting coated with this gritty dust being raised by these trucks that were going around and around us, making this horrendous racket. And he said something to the effect that the experience we've just all gone through with the interview with King was akin to if we'd been in the 19th century and had interviewed Charles Dickens, who was a very popular author in his time, who was not critically appreciated. And I think that may be part of it.
I'm reading everything. I'm reading everything that comes in. That is part of what I've taken on. That is part of my responsibility to the writer and to the readers. To the writer to gear them towards what I'm looking for, and to the readers to provide them the largest scope of possible fiction that I could have appear in the magazine. I think probably one of the biggest joys that an editor has is discovering someone new. Last winter, I got a piece from a fellow that lives in California, and when I read it, I was just sitting there going, "Oh wow, oh wow, I just cannot believe this. And that story appeared in issue 10. Number 12 has just come out. And it was one of the stories that was selected for Ellen Datlow's collection, her annual collection, to be listed in the recommended reading list. So that said to me that other people noticed too, that I thought that this was a very good story. There are other stories. There was a story called Bleeding Between the Lines by Wayne Allen Sallee, which some of you may be familiar with, that was picked up for the year's best horror, is going to be published next year. And also, going back to talking about children, there's a book called Scare Care that Graham Masterton edited and came out in England a year or so ago, and the American, the first U.S. Edition is either just coming out or came out not too long ago. There's also a story in there that originally was published in 2 a.m. I find that about half the stories that I receive do involve children. And things that as we're adults, we seem to want to forget that we were afraid of or still are afraid of. And it's just like those noises in the basement, or envisioning something eerie in the closet. I had a closet creature. I knew there was somebody in my closet when I was a kid, and I'd close the door and it kept on pushing it open. I knew there was something in there. I never found it though.
I sort of backed into writing horror. At that time I had acquired a literary agent, and he actually, The Manse, my first book, which was published in 1987, Halloween 1987, came to life in a sushi bar in New York. And it was not even my idea. It was between my editor now, she wasn't my editor then, Melissa Ann Singer at Tor Books, horror editor at Tor Books, and my literary agent, James Allen. And they were having lunch and talking about, he was talking to her about some clients and some things and various business matters. And after they got through with their business and their raw fish, he just threw out the comment. He said, "What would you really like to see? If you could have your choice of a manuscript coming across your desk, what would you really like to see?" And she said, "I would like to see an old-fashioned haunted house book, but with some sort of new twist." He said, "I've got just the author who can write it." Thanks, Jim. But maybe he had more confidence in me than I had in myself. Because then he proceeded to call me long distance and said, and she said, he told her, he said, "I have the author that can do this." And she said, "Well, who is it?" And he told her it was me. And she said, well, good. Have her do a proposal for me and have it on my desk in 2 or 3 weeks. He said, "Fine, it'll be there." Then he calls me and says, "Lisa, can you write a book about a haunted house?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, "I can try." He told me what had happened, and I said, "Well, it's certainly a foot in the door. Let's see what happens." And he said, "Okay, let's do me a proposal first on it." At that point, I really didn't have an idea. And I said, "Well, how do you do a proposal?" Because I'd never done that either, didn't know what one was. And he proceeded to say, "You do this, and a paragraph about this, and a paragraph about that, and you all sum it up like this, and you tighten a neat little bow and send it off." And I said, "Okay," and I did it, and sent it off to him, and it apparently passed his critical test, and he's very tough. He's as tough as any editor really ever has been, I think. But he sent that on to Melissa, and they looked at it at Tor, and they liked it. But they said, okay, let her write the manuscript, because they weren't buying my first book from someone they didn't know before, certainly on about a 20-page proposal. And they won't buy yours either. They want to see finished. They want to know whether you can follow through. So this was a comment that they really liked the idea, and if the manuscript was as good as the proposal and lived up to the potential of the proposal, that they didn't think contracts would be a problem. So I did write the book, and when she said haunted house, immediately I got a visual image of an old Victorian mansion in a small town close to me in Piedmont, North Carolina, up on a hill that the weeds had grown up, been abandoned for a number of years, and had been used for several years by the local group, the JC's, Junior Chamber of Commerce, for their Halloween House of Horrors. And they set up all their scenarios in it, and I had been through the house, the Halloween before. It's a lot of fun. And you just get a visual image of what's a haunted house. When you say the word haunted house, probably into everybody's mind is some sort of a visual image. Well, that was my visual image. And then I started a process of asking myself questions. And this is the way that you can approach developing a plot line. Often an aspiring author of novels sets themselves up to fail because they feel they must have a complete idea from start to finish, all the characters, all the ins and outs, all the plot developments and everything that goes into making a novel. Full blown, immediately, it's just got to come. When they're saying, I've got to have an idea, they don't think about it as being a little seed. They think of it as being, a giant redwood already, immediately, automatically. It's not going to necessarily come that way. You hear stories about the ones that do, and certainly sometimes they do. But generally, it's going to start with some sort of seed. So you take that idea, haunted house, and I had my visual picture of the haunted house with a new twist. And I started asking myself questions, what kind of twist, what kind of house, what is happening there, what kind of people would be involved. And I got the idea that the house was not already haunted because that had been done and redone. I got the idea that the house was in the process of becoming haunted, and I would allow the reader to see that process of the house becoming haunted. Let them in on things that the characters don't know. So hopefully as a reader, you're a participant. You're an observer on the page. And that has a certain effect with horror in the build-up as the reader maybe knows what's in the basement, knows what's behind the closed door, and yet they've got the unsuspecting character. They've got to watch that character go down the basement steps one at a time, or go toward the door and open it and hear the hinges creak as slowly it opens, and they're saying, no, don't go, don't do that, don't go, don't open that door. And so that's a different kind of a horror setup that you can contrive in your writing to involve the reader, as opposed to not knowing what's behind the door or in the basement, and yet you're knowing something, it is something horrible. So it's just a different...
Graduated. He didn't leave UNO, but for the next 6 weeks, 8 weeks, published installments of a Western called Slade. Anyone familiar with Slade? Okay. All right. From June to August, he published an installment every week. It's actually a game. I suspect it's more than a little relief of having graduated. At times, he thumbs his nose more than a little bit at authority figures and what have you. It basically is a story that simply reverberates with off-the-wall humor, with puns, every conceivable inversion of every conceivable convention of the Western, coupled with every conceivable cliche, characters, situations, the words that they use. In a moment of crisis in Chapter 7, Slade confronts the villains, Sam Columbine, who is the owner of the Rotten Vulture Ranch. Along with Columbine is his, quoting, "A #1 Top Gun, Pinky Lee." And King notes that the only two men in the American Southwest that could even approach Pinky for pure dad-ratted evil were Hunchback Fred Agnew, who Slade gunned down 3 weeks ago, and Sam Columbine himself. And now at the showdown, Pinky Lee dropped to his chest, fanning the hammer of his sinister Buntline special. Slade felt bullets race all around him. He fired back twice, but cursed, the hammers of his 2 sinister .45s only clicked on empty chambers. He had forgotten to load up after downing the 3 bad men back at the Rotten Vulture. Lee rolled to cover behind a barrel of taco chips. Columbine was already crouched behind a giant bottle of mayonnaise that had been airdropped a month after the worst flood disaster in the American Southwest history. Why drop mayonnaise after a flood disaster? None of your damn business. Taco chips? Mayonnaise? Hunchback Fred Agnew? Any relationship to a vice president we all know and love? In a Western? But he carries it off. There is so much energy, so much of a sense of fun. Even in the chapter, the non-chapter, one chapter doesn't disappear. It doesn't appear, and he explains it's not appearing because of attempts at censorship, so he's not going to write the chapter. But even there's such an enormous sense of energy and fun that we learn, not necessarily for the first time, that the King of Horror also has a very strong, if occasionally warped, sense of humor. But what I find interesting about Slade, in addition to the fact that it's just great fun, is his attitude toward the hero. The opening paragraph of Chapter 1, which was written in 1907, suggests parody and satire, but at the same time, there's something intriguing about this character. It was almost dark when Slade rode into Dead Steer Springs. He was tall in the saddle, a grim-faced man dressed all in black. Even the hands of his 2 sinister, they're always sinister, by the way, throughout the tires, of his 2 sinister .45s, which rode low on his hips, were black. Ever since the early 1870s, when the name of Slade had begun to strike fear into the stoutest of Western hearts, there had been many whispered legends about his dress. One story had it that he wore it in mourning as a perpetual emblem for his Illinois sweetheart, Miss Polly Peachtree of Paducah, who passed tragically from his vale of tears when a flaming Montgolfier balloon crashed into the Peachtree barn while Molly was milking the cows. But some said he wore black because Slade was the Grim Reaper's agent in the Southwest, the Devil's Hangman. And then there were some who thought he was queerer than a $3 bill. No one, however, advanced this idea to his face. Now, discounting for a second the obvious comedy elements, the consciously overblown Western rhetoric, the reference to homosexuality, which is also a recurring theme in virtually everything King writes, what remains is the dark man, the man in black, the archetypal gunfighter, the mysterious wanderer of the Western wastelands, in a word, the central figure of the Dark Tower. In those stories that have been republished as the Dark Tower and the Drawing Number 3, King transforms this comic Slade into the epic, tragic dark man, Roland, named after Browning's great poem, Child Roland to the Dark Tower King, and begins what is going to be an epic quest. Now, each of those books is about this thick. He figures he has about 3,000 pages more to write before he finishes the story of the Dark Man. The first line of The Gunslinger is, "The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed." And that's the same atmosphere as Slade, without the comedy, without the rhetoric. It's the same figure. A few paragraphs later, he writes, this is in Dark Tower, below the water belt were his guns, firmly weighted in his hands. The 2 belts crisscrossed above his crotch. The holsters were oiled too deeply for even the sun to crack. The stocks of the guns were sandalwood, yellow and finely grained. The holsters were tied down with rawhide cord, and they swung heavily against his hips. The brass casings of cartridges looped into the belts twinkled and flashed and heliographed in the sun. The leather made subtle creaking noises. The guns themselves made no noise. They had spilled blood. There was no need to make noise in the sterility of the desert. These are really sinister 45s. So in this early, fun short story is the kernel for The Dark Tower. Now, given that, it's not surprising that one of his first poems, published in 1969, was called The Dark Man. And it suggests the kind of relationship between King's early work and his later works. The interest in these poems in Slade and the Garbage Truck lies not so much in the fact that they're good, because some of them are not, as in the insights they give us of what King is going to become. One of the problems with the early poems is that they're very short, and King works best when he's writing very long things. The Stand and It are frequently referred to as favorite novels, and even the promise of another quarter of The Stand being returned to it, about 400 pages of manuscript added in a version that's going to be published next year, doesn't stimulate very many people to say, but it was too long already. They want more. And so when you set The Stand or It, or even Carrie or Salem's Lot up against a 40-line poem, it becomes rather trivial in comparison. But they're still interesting, they're still exciting, and they still suggest some of the things that King is interested in doing. His first poem.
Once upon a time, there was a young artist, or a musician, or a writer, who thought he had talent and dreamed of pursuing a career as an artist, or a musician, or a writer. One day he met Michelangelo, or Beethoven, or Shakespeare, and asked the great master of his painting, or score, or poem, show talent. Michelangelo, or Beethoven, or Shakespeare looked at the painting, listened to the score, read the sonnet, and shook his head in despair. "Do you really want my advice?" he asked. "Of course," said the young man. "Then you should give up this silly notion of wanting to become a great artist, or musician, or writer, and instead take up a valuable trade or become a merchant." The young man was heartbroken. He thanked the master for the good advice. Then he went off to pursue a career as a merchant. Years later, the same man met Michelangelo, Beethoven, or Shakespeare, quite by accident at a civic function. "Maestro," said the no longer young man, "I want to thank you again for the advice you once gave me. Thanks to you, I am now a successful merchant and the richest man in Rome, or Munich, or London." "What advice did I give you?" asked the master. "Why, don't you remember? You told me to give up my thoughts of ever becoming a great artist, or musician, or writer. Obviously, you must have known I have no artistic talent. I took your advice and became a merchant, and now I'm wealthy and very happy." "I never said you had no talent," said the master. "In fact, I seem to recall you had great talent. But then why on earth did you tell me to give up thoughts of becoming an artist, musician, or writer, and become instead a merchant?" "I say that to everyone who asks if they have talent. You see, my friend, many men have talent, but only those who know in their innermost hearts that they were meant to become artists, musicians, or writers, and therefore disregard my advice. Only those will ever become great. You see, it makes no difference what I tell them or what I told you. If they, you, have what it takes to become great, then they, you, will do it despite or in spite of whatever I tell them. You, my friend, were not meant to be an artist or musician or writer. If you had been, what I said would never have mattered
at all. One of the things that Stephen King says is that if you have a little bit of talent, you can become a successful writer. And what it takes is about 10 years of practice. That if you are a 98-pound weakling and you lift weights for an hour every day for 10 years, you'll develop muscles. If you are a fledgling writer and you write every day for an hour or an hour and a half or 3 hours or 4 hours, after 10 years, you'll get your writing published. And that's what Stephen King did. He started writing, half-heartedly, I guess, when he was about 4 or 5. Somewhere around age 8, he started becoming a little more serious about it. And when he was a teenager, he became quite serious about it. And then he went on to college and he became deadly serious about it. And he wrote every day. And still today, he writes every day. He takes 3 days a year off. And the rest of the time, he writes. He has a minimum number of words or a minimum amount of time each day that he is at his word processor. Every successful writer I know does the same thing. It doesn't matter whether you start at age 5 or whether you start at age 12 or whether you start at age 40. What matters is that you write for a specified period of time every single day. If it means getting up an hour earlier in the morning so that you can write for an hour before you go to work, if it means taking your lunch hour and writing during your lunch hour, if it means taking your 15-minute breaks in the morning, 15-minute break in the afternoon, and going into the restroom and sitting on the can with your tablet and pen, if it means coming home from work and instead of watching television, taking an hour or 2 to sit down and write, if that's what it takes, then that's what you got to do, and you do it every single day. I was up this morning at 5 o'clock, and I wrote this morning between 5 o'clock and 9. And yesterday, I was up at 4:30, and I wrote yesterday morning between 4:30 and 7. And it makes no difference where you are, and it makes no difference whether you're writing with a pen and paper or whether you're sitting at your word processor. What makes the difference is that you exercise that muscle, your brain, in a specific way. And I can't show you how to do it. What you've got to do is you've got to sit down with your blank piece of paper and a pen, or sit down in front of a blank piece of paper in your word processor, and write, and practice at it, and keep going. And after a period of time.
Okay, the next one will be Cujo. First edition, worth $80. The Dead Zone, which is back here, first edition, very good condition, $125. Winner is for first edition of Dark Tower 2, Drawing of the Three, this book right here, worth $150. Okay, the next is the first edition of the novel The Shining, in fair condition, that's this one right here. Okay. This has been appraised at $175. Okay, the next one is going to be the first edition of Pet Sematary, which is valued at $250. The number is 166. Here we go. What's your name?
Mark Brenner from Cleveland, Ohio.
Mark Brenner from Cleveland, Ohio. Congratulations, man.
But I was about to pick another one,
He asked me he has another chicken. He asked me what happens if he picks his own number. I said, I get it then. Okay. Let's see. These are, okay, the next one is the autographed copy, limited edition, Lord John Press, Dolan's Cadillac, worth $250. That winner is 168. You found it. And it really is autographed. I don't know if you can see this or not, but the autograph really is on this thing. Okay? Came with the book.
Dr. Denny from Malibu.
This is Dr. Pamela Denny from Malibu, California. Congratulations. This is the last one. This is it, guys. This one right here. Can you read the numbers? Okay. This is the first edition of The Shining in good condition. And it's valued at $350. That's a lot of scratch. Okay, here we go. The number 1, 6. That's disappointing people. 161. We have it right there. Come on up. Oh, come on, be sports, huh? What's your name, please?
Mark Brenner from Cleveland.
Well, in case you guys want to know, this is Mark Brenner from Cleveland. But he paid for him, so he's entitled to him. That was 217. Just look at the sign that says Bread Run. And that concludes our program for tonight. No, just kidding, folks. That concludes this portion of our program. At 7 p.m., we got a...
So I called the publicist for Maximum Overdrive. It was a man whose name I can't remember, but he was the unit publicist, and the first time I called, he said, "The set is completely closed." So I knew that being an entertainment writer for a small-town newspaper was not going to cut the mustard to get me onto the set. So Castle Rock had just recently gone from being a mimeographed newsletter done on, basically on the same thing they use for letterhead nowadays, to an offset printed newspaper, which is what it is today. And so I thought that they might be interested in an interview, and I wrote Stephanie Leonard a letter asking her if she would be interested. I explained that I did entertainment news for another paper and had some experience, and asked if she'd be interested. She wrote back, gave me a phone number, and said she'd be very interested, that as Stephen's secretary, she was too busy to go to North Carolina back and forth to do an interview, and that she didn't have the time or the interest, really, since she wasn't a writer herself, although she did do a lot of writing for the newsletter. So she was enthusiastic about it. With that in hand, I called back, and the publicists didn't tell me the set was closed. I explained, this is Stephen King newsletter. It's published by his secretary. Figured maybe that had a little more clout, and maybe it did. He at least didn't tell me it was closed and hang up on me, but it still didn't do the trick. At that point, I decided that I needed somebody with a little more clout, and at that time, about the best magazine covering horror, dark fantasy, and related fields was Twilight Zone magazine, which is sadly no longer among us. I had submitted fiction to them in the past and had not sold any, but I had managed to get acquainted with Alan Rogers, who was the associate editor at Twilight Zone at the time. So I called him up to see if he'd be interested and explained to him, I'm trying to get an interview with Stephen King on the set of Overdrive. Would you be interested? So he said, hang on a minute. And the next thing I know, I was talking to Michael Blaine, who was the editor of Twilight Zone. And he said, did you know that we were doing a special Stephen King issue? And I said, no, I had no idea. You forgot to tell me. And he said, did you know that we decided we weren't going to do anything on Maximum Overdrive because it's so close to going to the press, and our movie guy, James Vernier, is off in California covering something, and he just doesn't have any time to cover it. I said, no, I didn't know that either. He said, well, have you done any writing before that do you have any experience? I said, well, for the last 10 years or so, I've been doing entertainment features for this little small town newspaper in my hometown, and I got a news writing award a couple of years ago, so I guess I can do it okay. He said, well, can you deliver on a deadline? I said, well, what kind of deadline are you talking about? Said, well, it's real fast. I said, well, how fast? I said, well, about 2 weeks. And I said, oh, that's nothing. I thought you meant, a day or two. So what they, to make a long story short, because I want to do some other stuff, we agreed on it, and I found myself en route to Wilmington, North Carolina, assigned to cover Maximum Overdrive for Castle Rock and Twilight Zone. By the time, and it took months to set this interview up, even with 2 magazines buying the material, the magazine had gone to press already. It was 2 weeks past deadline. They were holding 2 pages of magazine open for me to complete this story. My posterior was in the wind, to say the least. I got to the set. How many of you have seen Maximum Overdrive? Okay. The Dixie Boy is here. Off to this side, the front faces me. Off to this side is a thing, it was like a garage. It's tires, storage or something. Inside there was the production office of the picture. It was a standing set. They went onto the parking lot of a factory and they built the whole truck stop from the ground up. It was really something. It was a functional place. Everything in there worked. They had power, the griddles would heat up, the whole 9 yards, and then they blew it all up about 2 days after we were there. So I arrived and parked in the wrong place and drove by it the first time because it looks like a real truck stop, except that when you look, there are these trucks lying around blown open and toilet paper all over the place and everything. So I walked up to the place, and the first person I ran into was Stephen King, and of course, with all the journalistic cool and professional aplomb at my command, I walked up to him and said, hi, my name's Tyson Blewett, please. And that lasted about 5 minutes, and because Stephen is a regular guy, if you ever get a chance to meet him, you'll find this out. Your nervousness will vanish in a very short time, and you'll enjoy it. I guarantee it if you ever get the chance. Everything went well. The interview was done, and I can safely say that I can write a story that I could sell in my sleep because I did it that night. Starting at about 3 in the morning, I borrowed a plug in the production office, plugged in my typewriter, and wrote the story, which was very heavily edited by Michael Blaine. The story that ran in Twilight Zone is not exactly the one I wrote, but it's close. And the amount of money they paid me, I could live with it. I Federal Expressed it out of Wilmington, first thing 6 o'clock in the morning, and if you've ever seen the issue, you know the story ran, and I got a lot of work from Twilight Zone. And that interview ran in Castle Rock in their November issue, and I've been in just about every issue after that. I called.
We had our own witch hunt a few years ago in the form of the Mies Commission, which took a new and different approach to pornography by saying that, well, there are types of pornography, whatever pornography is, there are types of pornography that involve violence. And quickly, the definition of pornography was not so much the sexual nature of the behavior, but the violent nature of the behavior. So much so that PBS was running, at the time the Mies Commission were holding their hearings, PBS ran a special that opened with the nail gun scene from Toolbox Murders, which features John Skipp's wife being nail gunned. And they said, you know, the Mies Commission today announced that it is the violence of pornography that is at the heart of the matter. And of course, you know, is the Toolbox Murders a pornographic film? Well, it's a horror movie without any kind of explicit sexual behavior. The Mies Commission said violence, it is violence that is at the heart of the kind of pornography that we believe should be at the top of the list of our prosecutions. But that's the Mies Commission, right? That's Ed Meese, we all know about him. That's Henry Hudson, who's a fanatical U.S. attorney. That's a bunch of misguided Reaganites out on a binge somewhere, and they spent tons of money, put this report together, and it's kind of out there. And we're not really seeing the fact that, seeing in the newspapers, reported the fact there are a lot of prosecutions going on out there now of so-called pornography under the aegis of the principles of the Mies Commission. But that's the Mies Commission, right? It's you know, that's our own nutcases. Let's look at something, you know, it's not so politicized. What about the women's movement, for example? What about the Indianapolis Ordinance, which essentially read as follows. A story that depicts women in positions of submission or display is forbidden if it is also violent. There are some other aspects of it towards sexuality. Regardless of the political or literary worth of the work taken as a whole. The Indianapolis Ordinance was stricken down by a federal court of appeals. And we can excuse it, I suppose, as an effort by extremists in the women's movement. Can we do that? What about people who are less extreme? What about the American Medical Association? What about the American Psychiatric Association? A few weeks ago, they started digging the bodies out of the mass graves down in Mexico. And it was immediately reported that a lot of those folks down there in this cult had apparently based what they were doing on a film called The Kindred. I think it's a John Frankenheimer film, which of course involves Santeria. Somebody seemed to miss the message that these were Santeria cultists to begin with, and the movie was about Santeria cultists, so it's not a question of fact-following fiction. But then there's the kid up in Massachusetts who allegedly had an obsession with the Friday the 13th films and the Faces of Death films, so he went out, of course, and beat his girlfriend to death with an axe handle. Or the boy up in Seattle who committed suicide, and on his wall were the covers of numerous copies of Gore Gazette and Fangoria. The doctors say, the psychiatrists say, at least those who are willing to become part of these lobbies, that there must be some causal connection there. We're not sure what it is, but it's obvious that there must be some kind of causal connection there. After all, you know, someone has an obsession with Friday the 13th films, which cause murder, which involve murders. They must in some way be predisposed to murder. Tevin King, who was the editor of Twilight Zone, and I were talking about this one night. He decided that the real cause of teenage murder and suicide was football.
because in almost every teenage boy's room you could find a football. Well, we've been talking about, these outsiders, right? Why don't we talk about, let's come closer to home. I've got here the New Horror Writers of America newsletter, which has in it a market report where the members of the Horror Writers of America, may wish to submit stories. I want to read the description, the content description for one of these sources. Will not consider anything, quote, in any way sexist, racist, or homophobic, end quote. I sold a story to a horror anthology. Now that's a magazine that the horror writers are reporting upon. I sold a story about a year ago to a horror anthology edited by a well-respected writer of horror fiction, whose name I won't identify. It was being printed by a well-respected press of sorts. And I got my contract for the story, and the contract said, the story will not depict violence or cruelty toward children. I sent the contract back. I said, this is curious for two reasons. First, there are no children in my story. But second, I won't sign a contract that says that I've got to be restricted in my content. But you see what I'm talking about, hopefully here. You see that there is a trend, a very real and a very deep trend within a form of fiction that we all hold dear, to restrict the content in ways that are completely different than government censorship. Sometimes they take the guise of self-censorship. Sometimes they take the guise of adherence to trendy ideals. Sometimes they take the guise of fulfilling extremely worthy causes. Nevertheless, they're directed toward the restriction of content. And any writer, and thus any reader worth their salt, should not want to participate in these enterprises. And I want to tell you what's happening in the marketplace right now.
Horror Readings 2 feature readings from Lisa Cantrell, Paul Dale Anderson, Tyson Blue, and Douglas E. Winner.
Material of construct, yet something seemed not quite right. The tank rested horizontally in a special set of power turning rolls that could rotate the vessel as needed. At the moment it was rotated so that the shell manhole was positioned about 2 feet off the ground. The manhole was uncovered to allow entry. A familiar shiver nudged Joe's spine, then slithered upward until he felt the hair on his neck come alive. No, not now, please not now, not here. It couldn't be here, it wasn't right here. He had to keep here clean for Christ's sake, it was all he had left. He stared at the small round hole in the huge gleaming shell and the darkness that lay behind. A cloudy cyclopean eye and a bloated silver giant. Joe felt wounded, sick. Gonna need an internal weld on the bottom head, the foreman was saying as he gestured with his clipboard toward the bloated silver giant. Equipment's already in place. Use the 5/32" stainless rod and set your machine. Joe tuned out. He knew what kind of welding rod to use, knew how to set his machine, and he knew what waited for him inside that tank. It had been a game all along. Nothing but a game. The dark thing's game. The dark thing, laughing at him, playing with him, feeding on his growing fear. The foreman kept walking.
Rather play than pounds. He talks to buy time. You'll have to kill me, he says. You killed Laura. You'll have to kill me too. You know that's impossible, Bob. Your life wasn't the slightest bit necessary, but you are. What would I do without you? Rot in hell, Bob suggests. I can punish you without killing. Perhaps you'd like a sample. Intense pain rips through his lower body, sending Bob to his knees in tears. This isn't real, he tells himself. None of this is real. His intestines feel as if they're being pulled from his stomach an inch at a time. A red-hot nail enters his urethra, penetrating all the way into his bladder before he screams. Stop, his mind cries. Oh, please, stop. Have you learned your lesson? The voice asked. Yes, I'll do anything you want, anything. Good, the voice says. The pain goes away, and Bob sleeps like a baby. Did you enjoy my little demonstration? The voice asks when Bob returns to consciousness. How? Divert endorphins from your pain centers, secrete acetylcholine.
Wolf continued to swagger, and the crowd cheered him on. When he was close enough, he swung at the hayseed, a wide arcing forearm that brought his weighty fist into the hayseed's neck just beneath the left ear. The hayseed heard something vaguely like the saw of a cello, then his knees buckled. The next blow flashed above his brow, barely missing, and as Wolf lashed out wildly with a booted foot, the hayseed dove at his ankles, tearing him down to the canvas where it battered the man's knees, his thighs, and finally his stomach. Feeling a dreadful turbulence surge in his chest, a howl more pure than any he'd ever uttered, a howl that tore from his soul through his throat. He lifted the ragdoll weight of Wolf over his shoulder with one hand, then drove him face first into the canvas. And again, and a third time, as if Wolf had no weight or substance. The crowd was on its feet, the lights hot, sweat pouring from his head, and he could feel the howl again, gripping him, moving from his roiling stomach, clawing its way to his mouth as he watched Wolf's head spray spidery shooting webs of blood across the mat with every blow. The referee tried to grab him and back him off. The hayseed slammed him off his feet with a single swat of his open palm. He picked Wolf up and smashed him down on the top of his head, and saw the blood on his fingers, his palms, blood smeared across his shoulder and running down his chest. And as he picked Wolf up yet again, he knew that it was over. It had to be over. The howling hayseed was gone. And Jake Carpenter, sickened, released him and sat down where he stood, hands limp between his legs, mouth open and gulping air. He heard then a distant rush of cheering.
Yes. As you doubtless know, John Lennon is still alive. In fact, if you're a fan, you probably bought his new album when it debuted last week. I bought it. It's a good enough piece of work, I guess, but somehow I just can't really enjoy it very much. Why, you ask? I admit it doesn't make much sense when you think that I went through all that trouble to get back in time and save the guy's life. The logical assumption would be that I'd be delighted every time I saw him on the tube or heard him on the radio, knowing that I was the one who'd made it all happen. And if that had been all that I'd changed, then maybe I would feel that way. But in all my calculations, the only factor I'd taken into account would be what effect John Lennon would have on the progress of history as it had taken place before my trip back. The factor I never considered was Mark Chapman. I'd figured that my actions had placed Chapman so far in the spotlight where Lennon was concerned that he would be powerless to harm him. I never considered that if you dam a stream in one place without safeguards, it will simply turn its assault in another direction. Oh yeah, I'd changed things all right. Excerpted from King Goes to the Beach, Howard Warren of Castle Rock, the Stephen King newsletter, December, January, 1986-87, page 10. King got the idea for the novel Misery during his first promotional tour for The Shining in New York City. As he was leaving Rockefeller Center from a television interview, he was mobbed by fans asking for autographs. One in particular had a strange gleam in his eyes, a blank, vacant stare, and he approached King with some paper and claimed, "I'm your #1 fan." King gave him an autograph, and the fan then asked for a picture of him. They posed for a Polaroid, and then the fan asked for an autograph on the photo, too. King was handed a special marking pen that writes on photographs. The fan had obviously done this often, and he signed the picture and watched the fan walk away. What he had written, "Best wishes to Mark Chapman from Stephen King."
The Horror Writers of America is a self-help organization that's been assembled of active horror writers, would-be horror writers, editors, agents. And the organization is intended principally to assist writers of fiction collectively in their dealings with publishers, agents, magazines. The organization to date has been self-funded by contributions of its members, including some extraordinary contributions from certain of its members. This year we're beginning to go out to certain conventions to hold auctions such as this, which offer you the opportunity not only to make some contributions to a very worthy cause, but also to place your hands on some very unique items. I hope you've had a chance to look at least most of them. I'll try to... Okay, next we have a very, very unique item from Chet Williamson. It's the hardcover edition of his novel Ash Wednesday from Tor Books, but it has a little bit of a difference to it. Inlaid is a letter from Chet, which describes that difference. To all prospective HWA benefactors, this is an inscribed first edition of Ash Wednesday with a goofy little bonus thrown in. This is the preliminary dust jacket that I was sent, complete with embossing. When the final dust jacket came out, there was some good news and some bad news. The bad news was that the embossing was dropped. The good news was that they spelled my name right. That's right, Chet Williamson. Not once, not twice, but 4 times, counting flaps and spine, appears on this cover. The only other people that I know who have this amusing and humiliating oddity are a friend I gave one to, and a few people at local bookstores who I gave them to for promotional purposes, but who no doubt tossed them away as soon as I left their store. The folks at Tor undoubtedly shredded the rest, not wanting their art director's mistake to be made public. And don't worry, there's a real live official Spalding dust jacket underneath the goofy one. $2.95 and I'm going once. $2.95 twice.
Wake up.
Last chance.
Sold for $295. Thank you. We have 2 items left and we still don't have enough money. So I'm going to sell this shirt off my back. That's what we're down to. A fine shirt designed by Thomas Canty, illustrator extraordinaire, the illustrator for the Donald M. Grant limited edition of Primeval, as well as for the New American Library editions. On the front, you see his logo, the face of a mysterious person who has nothing to do with me, and my name down at the bottom, on the back. The Hall of Fame. This is an extra large, will fit anyone. $30. 30. The names are spelled correctly. $30. 30 once. 30 going twice. Sold. Thank you very much.
We hope you have enjoyed these excerpts from Horrorfest 89. Again, this edited version is only able to convey a fraction of what really happened up there on that frightful weekend.